are here with two fabulous guests to discuss this evening's very interesting topic for us. This is hosted, of course, by Asia Pacific Youth Association. So thank you to the association for hosting this event. And here we are welcoming Ross Feingold and Melissa Conley Tyler. Welcome to the show.
Great pleasure, Liam.
Thanks for inviting me.
It's an absolute pleasure. We are here to discuss the G7, the Indo-Pacific, and Taiwan. Is the global pushback against China changing Taiwan's international status? We will dive into many questions about this tonight. I would like to start us off by looking from the macro lens at what has just happened in Europe with Biden's trip and diving into what it all means in terms of our constructs of America being back and the West is back. So many in the media have been referring to this as a turning point. From Biden's original campaign slogan of America being back to expanding it to the West, or perhaps we can say the West and Japan is back.
Yeah, and I'd come in on that.
Signs of a more.
So maybe, Ross, we can answer that. Do we think the West is back? From my side, I do think that's the message that has come out of G7. It's the West is still important. We are relevant. We are here. And certainly there's more of a sense that it's more united. I know, in recent years, I've been going to dialogues with the EU, for example. And at first, when you talk about things in our region, basically, they weren't very interested. Then we moved into the phase where they were like, okay, well, rules-based international order, we get that. We're talking about Russia, you're talking about China, but at least we've got something to talk about there. And these days, now they're talking about the Indo-Pacific. A lot of the Europeans have Indo-Pacific strategies, and they're starting to see this as an important arena in the global contest. So in that sense, yes, I think there's a much more cohesive view from the G7. Now, is the G7 a fading institution? Well, who knows? It's one of those things you only know in retrospect. It may end up looking like the Suez, the sort of the last gasp of the time when the G7 used to run the world, or it might be the start of the G7 becoming more cohesive and pushing back, and we'll have to see.
Well, I'm very leery of sloganeering like President Biden and his team have taken a liking to. Unfortunately, it's repeating the model of President Obama when he took office in 2009 and his team. But we're back. The West is back. The U.S. is back. The U.S. never left. People could dislike President Trump or his team's policies, whether in Europe or in Asia, other parts of the world. But I disagree with the notion that the U.S. needed to come back, or even the G7 or major Western countries needed to go back to anywhere. They've always been in most places. I mean, they might change their policies in any given period of time, subject to budget concerns, different priorities of different political leaders when they're in office. But even David Cameron, the former UK Prime Minister, they talked constantly about being in China. Now, of course, that was in the context of a happy relationship and not a challenged relationship like exists now between those two countries. But I cite that as just one example of a G7 country that has been engaged in Asia. Again, their policy choices may have been incorrect or arguably even naive, but they were there. I mean, the Trump administration had good relationships with some countries in Europe, but obviously not with all the countries in Europe. But Trump being right of center, and the current Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Boris Johnson, being right of center, they got along fabulously. On the other hand, obviously Trump didn't get along well with Merkel, closer to the U.S. but further from Europe, but also in the G7. The U.S. didn't get along so well with Canada. or Trump, I should say. But on the other hand, Trump got along with some of the leaders in Eastern Europe. So again, I'd be very careful about statements like the U.S. or Europe is back. Ideally, we would be analyzing this from the perspective of, do these countries have prudent policies or not? Do they have policies that are good for their countries, which is their first responsibility? Do they have policies that are good for their region, which is very important in the context of the EU because they do operate regionally, or they aim to have cohesive foreign policy. And ultimately, are these policies good for the world? But you can see I have a very strong feeling against notions that U.S. or any other country or these major countries were not engaged in other parts of the world.
Yeah, and look, I can see where you're coming from, but I think you've got to say Trump had a distinctive view about partners and allies, quite different from earlier Republican presidents who saw the alliance system as the cornerstone of the way that the US, worked and used its power. I mean, Trump essentially called allies and partners freeloaders. Look at the negotiations with South Korea, with Japan. Look at his views in the NATO summits. These institutions could not come up with agreed communiques during the Trump years because the US would not agree with those partners. So I think there is a difference. I mean, I'm not into the sloganeering either. I agree, America is in the region, it's not that it's back. But the idea of working together with allies and partners, I think that is a difference in the way that the Biden administration is working compared to the Trump administration.
Well, the statements, the joint statements, the communiques at the end of bilateral, multilateral meetings, those are nice, but they're not the end all to be all, which is why I'm not going to be very excited about things like the Japanese prime minister, the South Korean president visiting the White House and making statements that refer to Taiwan. I don't get too excited about that either. Yeah, sure. Trump had some difficulty, to put it mildly, with the joint statements or with the group photos and things like that. He wasn't a big fan of the multilateral organizations. On the other hand, it's been a long position of certainly conservative foreign policy analysts, Republican politicians, to expect the traditional allies in Western Europe, as well as in East Asia, and specifically Japan and South Korea, to some extent the Philippines as well, to spend more on their national defense. Trump was obviously very forthright about that. Now, to be fair to President Trump, we might not like his word choice, but the reality is he got some of these countries to spend a little bit more money. So the concern now is Biden, he's such a nice guy. It's the traditional American liberal Democrat approach to foreign policy, where the group photo is really important, the communique is really important, but when it comes to the substantive action, which I'm sure we'll talk a lot more in the course of this conversation, are they really going to increase those defense budgets? Obviously, that remains to be seen as well. So, fair point that the meetings, the bilateral meetings or the bilateral relationships with some traditional allies were strained at times. But, for the Biden administration to already be, kind of celebrating we're back, well, the substance was actually getting Japan and Korea or some of the Western European countries or the NATO members to spend more on defense. So we could focus on President Trump's way of doing things, and it's easy to do that. And there's much to say. Well, he could have been a little bit nicer when he spoke to Trudeau or Merkel, but ultimately it's the substantive output. And I'll make one final point on that. Even among the traditional allies, some of those relationships were still very, very good with Trump. I mean, clearly, the Japan-U.S. relationship was very strong. I mean, President Trump and former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. I mean, they obviously got along very well. I mean, that's just a fact.
No, I accept with that. I think I'd put in, though, that public opinion is also a fact, and you can't talk that away. If the public opinion in America's traditional allies and partners plummets under Trump, then something has happened to those relationships.
Wonderful.
But Liam, we won't talk over you.
No. I appreciate this. Is a fantastic. We're getting both sides here. So, well, I mean, in summary, what we can see is that it's a change of form from a unilateral approach with Trump sort of emphasizing bilateral ties and doing things that way to a more multilateral approach, which is more true to form of democratic leaders, as Ross just pointed out there. I think also it's interesting, or it's important to keep in mind that for the last couple of years, either due to COVID or for other reasons, the G7 annual summit was not actually had. So, that wasn't an actual experience that the countries had to, look forward to. But we've just briefly mentioned there Taiwan's famous mention in the final communique, the final joint statement of the G7 summit. So this has ignited lots of discussion here, obviously. So although this could be perhaps seen as more symbolic than of tangible value, the fact is this is a significant, notable elevation of the time.
Absolutely, Leah.
Straight.
So I'll come in on that, on the internationalisation of the Taiwan Strait issue, as I would see it. I think there's been times in the past where the view has been more like, oh, well, that's a China-Taiwan problem. They can sort it out for themselves. And I can see from a Taiwanese perspective that wouldn't necessarily be very attractive. I think the idea of internationalising the issue is to say this is an Indo-Pacific security problem. This is everyone who lives in the Indo-Pacific, or everyone who cares about what happens in the Indo-Pacific. This is a problem you should care about too. So I suppose we've seen a bit of a lead up on this. So we see the mention in the Biden-Suga summit. We see a mention in the Biden-Moon summit. It's then in an Australia-Japan, a bilateral summit, and then you see it in the G7. And so what I'm seeing there is that the traditional network of allies and partners being pulled in to get behind peace and security in the Taiwan Strait as an issue of concern to all of us.
Well, Melissa, I think you hit the key word, and I'm going to repeat what I've said in other public appearances in the interest of consistency. These statements they mentioned the body of water. They mentioned the Taiwan Strait. It's the ultimate cop-out that they didn't mention Taiwan as a place. They didn't mention the people or the government of Taiwan. Now, maybe a future edition of these statements will make that change, because they'll say they watched this program and they saw that Feingold guy complain that they only mentioned the body of water and they didn't mention the people or the government, the island. They didn't mention the polity. They could write around the word country if that was the concern, and they didn't want to say that Taiwan's a country or a nation or it's autonomous or it's independent. They could have written around all of that. But ultimately, they still referred only to a body of water. And I think people here in Taiwan need to have a reality check. And I'm going to say that very directly. Wake up, people. All these statements did was refer to the Taiwan Strait and the peace and security in the Taiwan Strait. Again, maybe future statements, they'll resolve that and they'll refer to Taiwan, because they often do refer to Taiwan in bilateral statements or bilateral Taiwan in those governments. So it could be a meeting about trade or cultural issues, but it's not unusual for the United States or Japan to refer to Taiwan as a place, a democracy, a trading partner, an important economy, et cetera, et cetera. But these statements, they were carefully crafted to avoid doing that. So, as I said earlier, I'm not going to get all excited simply because these statements refer to the Taiwan Strait. And there really was a lack of a emphatic endorsement for Taiwan's autonomy in those statements as well. So again, I think people here in Taiwan need to be a bit realistic about what those statements said and, frankly, what they didn't say.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think you can overread these things. I think, though, it is a clear progression. It's something we haven't seen before, those mentions in those summits in that way. And, yeah, you don't want to read too much into them, I agree, but it is a change from what we've seen in the past.
It is exactly a step up, although, as Ross pointed out, as it mentioned, it was the Taiwan, the body of water. So it can be overplayed. So we do have to take things with caution. But I think it's the overall trend that we're looking to identify here. And the trend seems to be pointing a particular way into an expansive, rhetoric regarding, some of the security threats that China poses in the Indo-Pacific region. So I think maybe those are the main takeaways. G7, of course, was followed by NATO summit within the same week, where talk was tough again on China, though, of course, Russia was still broadly the focus. So how do you see the discussion about NATO expanding into the Indo-Pacific? Won't this, overlap with other groupings such as the Quad and others that are in the Indo-Pacific? There seems to be a lot of overlap here in terms of the functionings, although both the Quad and NATO are supposedly, pillars of the democratic order in each of their hemispheres. But of course, the Quad is sometimes being called Asia's NATO, but it is nowhere near as institutionally evolved as that. So I can see Melissa having a chuckle about that. Let's go to Melissa. Thank you. What do you think about NATO's role in the Indo-Pacific now, Melissa? Do you have some thoughts? Thank you.
Yeah, look, I wasn't surprised by the NATO summit. I mean, it's always going to care more about Russia. That's utterly unsurprising to all of us. I think NATO does find it hard to expand beyond, its core mission, and that might be a good thing. It's not bad for organisations to know what it is that they do and to focus on it. I'm speaking, I suppose, from the experience of Australia, which is not a member of NATO, but for 20 years we've been, a partner with NATO in what's been happening in Afghanistan. And I think that challenged NATO in a lot of ways, that long, long war in Afghanistan, for it to try to understand that and bring that within its mission. So, as I say, I'm unsurprised. But I think NATO should have some interest in what's happening with China as a global power, even if it's not its main focus.
Well, the first stage here will be that NATO will continue to talk about this part of the world at various levels of the NATO organization, from the most junior to the most senior level. So that's a given. So what's also a given is the money's going to flow, right? So as bloated as some of these multilateral organizations are, and instead of spending money on weapons and the troops, they're going to start spending money on, conferences and, maybe Melissa, with any good fortune, you'll be a visiting fellow at NATO and, get to spend some time in Brussels, which frankly is not so bad. But that's what's going to happen, right? There'll be a lot of talk about NATO and Asia. They'll spend a lot of money on this. Mm-hmm. They'll issue a lot of nice papers. They'll talk some more. But will there be a NATO organized military exercise in this part of the world? Well, that's clearly a long way off. And as Melissa pointed out, one of the most important Western democracy security partners in this part of the world is not a NATO member, Australia. So you'd have to figure out, how would NATO and Australia do some kind of exercise. But look, I mean, we're so far away from most of the NATO members endorsing any kind of substantive military action. And when I say military action, I mean things like exercises in this part of the world. So again, the most likely outcome in the near term is to talk, and then in the medium term, spend some money on conferences and things like that. But again, I'm going to hold back my optimism on NATO being an operational organization in this part of the world.
Sure. And that said, of course, it doesn't need to be. I mean, individual countries can decide that they want to be involved, as the UK currently is, with, a group coming into the Indo-Pacific, as France is. Individual NATO members can be involved in the region if they find it, a region that they
yeah,
want
but
to.
the key there is, when are they going to come back? So, these three major European militaries, have announced plans to sail around this part of the world in this year. But when are they going to come back after that, right? They're going to spend so much of their budgets. The optics, they have elections. Someone's going to say, maybe we don't want to do that anymore. We have domestic priorities. It angered China, and that hurt our business interests. I mean, who knows? So, I mean, we have to be very cautious about whether or not that's sustainable.
Yeah, I'm probably somewhat suspicious on the global Britain. I think France does actually see itself as Indo-Pacific power, for what it's worth. It's a resident power in the Pacific, and I think it sees its interests a little bit more strongly.
Okay, well, very interesting points from both of you in this regard. So I think that gives us a more nuanced perspective there, at least in terms of NATO's military or physical presence in the Indo-Pacific. Now let's look at Australia, which Ross just mentioned is, indispensable security ally, yet is also not in NATO, but certainly is within the Quad and many other Indo-Pacific groupings. So, although technically not a G7 member, Australia is never far from the table. In fact, Trump floated the idea of Australia joining as part of a G10, or some say the D10, Democratic 10 format, which some still discuss to this day. So, noting the strident anti-China rhetoric that was on show at the summit, some leading Australian journalists pointed out that the group is now mirroring Australia's language on China. And the summit was a strong international endorsement of the Morrison government's approach to China and the strong rhetoric that was used. So to quote journalist Chris Ullman, in some ways, Australia has led the world to this understanding of China, end quote. So perhaps Australia could be seen as having some sort of outside influence from the sidelines on China here. I'd like to start with you, Melissa, of course. What do you make of this reading of Australia's presence at the G7? And do you think Australia's experience of its falling out with China over the last couple of years has influenced the conversation within the rest of the group? Thank you.
Look, there's a certain amount of blowing one's own trumpet there, which I'm sure will be used politically, and that's how it is. But look, I think in terms of substance, Australia would be very happy that its strategy has been to get out in front on a number of issues and to build a coalition of other countries around. So that would be things like an early decision on Huawei and then trying to talk to other countries about that, early foreign interference legislation, again, trying to be an exemplar. At the G7 meeting that we were invited to the sidelines of, Prime Minister Morrison actually took with him the list of 14 grievances prepared by the Chinese embassy in Canberra, saying this is the sort of pressure, this is what we are being asked to compromise, you don't want this to happen to you. And I think there is certainly some sympathy for the economic coercion. I'm sure they had some freedom wine at those meetings, and that's nice. Do I think Australia can claim the credit? I think that's going a little bit far. But I think Australia would probably be happy with the direction that discussions among allies and friends are going.
Liam, when you were asking your question and you said the word strident anti, I thought you were going to be referring to the strident anti-Biden, anti-Democrat, anti-liberal voices that come out of Australia, especially from certain media in Australia, as well as certain politicians. I mean, there's certain politicians in Australia who would easily get elected in what we call red states in the United States, and there's certain media personalities you could just plop them down in the United States on certain media networks, and they'd be a big hit. So I bring this up because the ability of Prime Minister Morrison and President Biden to develop a strong rapport really remains to be seen. I mean, maybe China might be an easy issue, but look, these two guys, their views on social policies, environmental policies,
very much,
are so divergent that I think I'm being diplomatic when I put it that way, that it could have an effect on the overall working relationship, even if they agree on things related to China or other action within Asia, such as funding infrastructure spending, things like that. And, as is the case with most of the recent Australian leaders, you don't know how long he or she's going to be around either. And they have an election coming up. Melissa, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's next year, right?
Could be late this year or
it could be
next year.
I don't expect a leadership spill, but yeah, I mean, they could call a snap one just to extend the term. But look, Australia's leaders are only in office, for 3 years, somewhat unusual for Western democracy. How much is Biden going to invest in this particular relationship, especially if their views diverge on things like climate change? Who knows?
I agree. And Biden may have come in thinking Morrison was a bit of a Trump stan, and how much time will I put in this guy? It's quite possible.
No, those are some good points. And exactly like, as you said, upcoming election, you never know what's around the corner, in terms of a potential new administration there in Canberra. So I'd like to take our focus now to the Putin-Biden summit, which was the last big get-together of Biden's Europe tour. The increasingly united transatlantic front against Russia and China risks pushing the two autocratic superpowers closer together. That's how many have interpreted it, which it could be a real headache for the U.S. Many policy analysts have long said the U.S. can either contain Russia or contain China, but cannot contain both at the same time. There is a strong push in the Washington policy community for some level of appeasement with Russia to prioritize countering China. Yet many European allies are more concerned with Russian interference in their affairs than Chinese. So I'd like to put this first to you, Ross, and then we'll see what Melissa has to say. How do you think Biden will try to walk this thin line? And do you think that there is eventual possibility of the U.S. trying to co-opt Moscow to isolate Beijing in a reversal of their Cold War strategy of rapprochement with the PRC to isolate the Soviet Union?
Well, clearly Biden's comfortable talking about Europe and Europe, including Russia-related security issues. The guy came of age in the Senate during the Cold War. So the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, most of the first decade of this century as well. The guy was in the Senate, and they were talking about Russia issues a lot of the time. Eventually, there were more China issues as well, but he's clearly comfortable talking about Russia and making Russia a country of concern. And that's based on his own personal experience, so it's understandable. And then there's the concern of many Democrats about Russia interference in the 2016 election and that it helped Trump get elected, and interference in the 2020 election as well. So it's easy to understand the focus on Russia. And I mentioned that background because then it makes it very easy if countries in Europe say, help us with Russia-related issues. It's easy to understand that Biden will have some enthusiasm to do that. But even in recent weeks, though, we do see some interesting developments. France and Germany are talking about more outreach to Russia. Some other European countries, most notably Poland, are pushing back on that. On the other hand, Biden administration, to the surprise and disappointment of many, has basically said Nord Stream 2 could proceed. We're not going to take further action to stop that. And again, that kind of surprised and disappointed a lot of people, both in the United States as well as in Europe. Not the Germans, they were happy about that. So it's a bit in flux, but I think Biden's natural inclination is to see bad intentions by Russia and to take action in response to that. Will the U.S. and Russia cooperate against China? I think there's almost no chance of that. The security relationship, the sale of weaponry by Russia to China is so important to Russia. Putin obviously likes doing things that annoy or destabilize the United States and Western Europe. China is never going to complain about that. The issues related to civil society, the arrest and imprisonment of dissidents, in Russia. Obviously, China is not going to complain or vote for sanctions or any kind of multilateral actions against Russia on that issue. It's a matter of internal affairs for Russia in the view of China, just as the similar issues are a matter of internal affairs for China as well. So I think all of this really shows that even if Russia and China are not going to be best buddies, the idea of Russia and the West cooperating against China, I think that's far-fetched.
Melissa, how do you see it?
Yeah, well, look, it's not a topic I give any advice to anyone on. Russia is essentially not a factor at all in Australian foreign policy. I suppose one of the things I'm seeing at the moment is what I see as a bigger issue of a larger group of autocratic countries. So not just China and Russia, not just the big ones, but your stock standard, run-of-the-mill autocratic countries, which is in fact most countries in the Indo-Pacific, if you're going to be honest about that, yeah? And I think part of, if we go back to where we started, part of this idea of G7, West is back, we're going to have some sort of summit of democracies, for democracies, whatever that turns out being. It's about sort of pushing back a bit and saying there are really good things about the democratic form of government and we shouldn't be shy about that. We should actually be promoting that. Now, that can turn somewhere I don't like, which is a bit sort of ethnic chauvinist. That's not where I would be going. What I would be saying is that norms of good governance make countries more successful, and we should be promoting that strongly rather than giving up that particular fight.
Ross, would you concur with that? Is there anything you'd like to add?
Well, on the assumption that what Melissa just said is accurate, then again, I think that would make it really unlikely for greater cooperation against China, by cooperation between the Western countries, Western European countries, United States with Russia. And in fact, it would indicate that the near to medium term means there's going to be more sanctions and pushback against Russia by the Western countries. Although again, we see a bit of a weakening of that with France and Germany's proposed initiative in recent days, as well as the Biden response to Nord Stream 2. I'd also caution that here in Asia, where I agree with Melissa that a number of countries are either soft or hard autocratic, but some of the democracies like South Korea or Japan, they rarely talk about this. I mean, South Korea is obviously interested in North Korea as the number one issue. The current president is extraordinarily reluctant, President Moon, to criticize human rights issues in North Korea. Japan is really interested in providing development aid around the region. It's often done in the interest of expanding business opportunities for Japanese conglomerates. We don't see Japan lecturing countries in Southeast Asia about their human rights records or the faults in their democracy. Japan kind of comfortably leaves that to the United States and maybe to a lesser extent Australia.
And one really positive development is that, a relatively new democracy like Indonesia is actually now starting to be much more assertive on promoting democracy. If you look at the way it's been spearheading a response to the coup in Myanmar in ASEAN, for example, it is possible for not just traditional Western democracies, but a range of other countries as well to talk about.
Melissa, I'm going to say, you give me a call or you take me out for a beer when Indonesia says, Vietnam, you got to do more for democracy, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Brunei.
They're doing for some. Well, what's interesting, Vietnam's a great example because I'd buy you a beer if the US or if Australia did that either. People tell me all the time that Vietnam is a friend. It's a great country. I've heard someone in the last week in an event on the Quad say that Vietnam's a democracy. That's because we like them, and if we like them, they therefore must be a democracy.
Well, you might want to suggest to that person that they walk down a street in Hanoi shouting slogans against the government or encouraging factory workers to organize independent labor unions and see what happens to them.
Exactly. Yeah, I did mumble something about the Communist Party of Vietnam, but there it is. We left that there. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's clearly, obviously, some blind spots in every country, even when they get on their moral high horse and make certain lecturings toward other countries. Their own strategic factors always sort of front of mind. We have to sort of take some of these with a grain of salt, of course. However, I think possibly what seems to me is interesting, or we can say a pivotal shift in terms of Biden's new approach seems to be about making it about a competition between democracy and autocracy rather than a confrontation, a unilateral confrontation, for example, between the U.S. led by Trump and China. Not to get us back into the Biden-Trump sort of a comparison there, but I think there's something interesting about trying to, quote unquote, build back better or to reform American democracy or democracy globally to make it a more holistic, representative, and more powerful system that actually delivers for the needs of the people, rather than simply berating autocracies for not being free or living up to sort of high-minded values. Let's just get your take on that idea of making democracy a more competitive option in comparison to autocracy. We'll start with Melissa, we'll end with Ross, and then I think it's almost about time to wrap it up this evening. Melissa, what do you think?
No, you're right, and I think it's a really interesting that idea that we're in a competition of systems, and does democracy or autocracy perform better? I think that melts together Biden's domestic and international agendas. I think that's why it's useful politically. I see that as fitting in with that stuff on foreign policy for the middle class. The idea that there's a domestic battle and we'll win that, and it links with this international. Look, it's an interesting one. I would like to say, from my perspective, I feel like democracy should win that competition. But then again, I'm not absolutely certain I want to run the race, if that makes sense. I hope I know who would win the race. I think Australia's democracy promotion for a long time has been very, very non-ideological, actually. Our attitude is that good governance, and I talk about it as good governance because I think democracy is actually quite loaded in that sense and can have a sense of being one particular culture's idea. But the idea of good governance, that to me, is demonstrably, empirically good for countries. And you can look at all sorts of countries at all sorts of levels of development and say, if you have good governance where people are involved in decisions that affect their lives, where you don't have corruption, where, all of these things, it makes for a better society. And so when you're promoting it in that sense, relatively neutrally, the same way you might say, I don't know, if you have a water treatment plant, your water will be better. You're trying to put it in those sort of terms, that this is just going to make things better for you. It's not my civilization pushing something onto you. It's here's an invention and it works. Give it a shot. So that's how I think one can try to make that argument. If it's all ideological, if it's a club and only some people are in the club, I worry about whether that actually discourages countries from trying to improve their governance, which I think is good for everyone. So that's why I'm a little torn on the concept.
I see. Yeah. No, that's a very nuanced perspective. I think our audience can appreciate it. Ross?
Well, just like 4 years ago, people in the Trump administration probably high-fived each other when they said, well, we'll call it the Indo-Pacific, we'll come up with a new term. People in the Biden team, they probably high-fived each other when they said, we'll call it a foreign policy for the middle class. We'll say America is back, and all this other nice rhetoric. It's a competition instead of, conflagration or whatever, Trump people were bringing us to, right? So they probably got all excited about their keywords, just like the Trump people got excited about their keywords. But Liam, you made a really good point when you said this kind of, there's this crossover, this mixture of the domestic policy and the foreign policy. And the reason why what you said is important is when Biden says, we got to have good democracies, and then we could maybe tell the other places they should be democracies too. he's not getting buy-in from about half of America.
Yeah.
Right. So if the Democratic Party caucus in Congress, whether on the House side or the Senate side, talking heads on television, the president and his team are saying we have institutionalized racism in the U.S. and we need to have critical race theory taught in the schools. Even if one gives them the benefit of the doubt and says they're correct, they're still not getting buy-in from half the country. So, the ability to mix these things, to come up with a coherent foreign policy approach, it's not going to happen. Unfortunately for the Democrats, they've turned out to be terrible messengers. They got elected because people didn't like Trump, so they retook the House in 2018. They barely kept it in 2020. They had terrible results in the Senate. And because of what happened in Georgia, they were able to eke out a 50-50 Senate, sort of have unified government subject to filibuster and a whole bunch of other stuff. But they're not very good messengers. And so, again, half of America is not buying into their message that our own democracy is so flawed. For better or for worse, I'm just saying that's the reality. So, for the U.S. then to say, well, we're gonna fix our own democracy, and then we'll come and lecture the other Western democracies about fixing their democracies. And then, oh, by the way, we'll go lecture the autocracies, including China, about fixing their autocracies. That's not really a formula for getting stuff done in the near term. To bring that back to Taiwan, I'd be really worried. I mean, if I was a Taiwan government, I'd be really worried about the United States having an internal battle about critical race theory and institutional racism and defunding the police, and what that takes away from a focus on foreign policy or defense spending. And we see that the budget, the headline number of the Biden proposed defense budget is an increase, but when you factor in inflation and how much is being spent on weapons and specifically the Navy, you got to be concerned about what the priority focus is going to be. I mean, from outside, right? So countries outside the U.S., whether you're Taiwan or you're Poland that's under threat from Russia, or you're Ukraine, some other places around the world, you need to be concerned.
Yes.
And worse, if you're in a semi or an autocratic regime, you might look at how democracies have been performing, particularly over the last year, and wonder whether it's a good idea at all. I mean, I think if we are going to talk about it as a contest, we have to be really good exemplars of our own system and do it well.
Well, you're doing well in Australia because you haven't overthrown internally this prime minister. So I guess that's a step forward compared to the predecessors who got thrown out by their own party.
Yes, one step at a time. Yes, that's right. Well, thank you to both of you. Thank you so much, Mr. Ross Feingold and Professor Melissa Conley Tyler, for both sharing your very insightful opinions and thoughts with our audience this evening. You have just been watching here on our live broadcast on Facebook, our discussion about the G7, the Indo-Pacific and Taiwan. Is the global pushback against China changing Taiwan's international status? We answered a little bit of that. We delved into that question. We delved into so much more. Spoke about the importances of democracy. We spoke about Russia. We looked at the EU. We looked at various approaches, multilateral, unilateral approaches. We covered the gamut. It was an incredible discussion. Thank you to both of you again. And on behalf of the Asia Pacific Youth Association, we very much look forward to bringing you back on for more forums and webinars in the future. Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you, Liam. Good to talk, Ross.
We'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone.
Brilliant. Well done. You feeling okay with your with your mic? That made it a bit hard. I hope we did okay in just sort of talking, so there wasn't a gap. Yeah.
Yes, no, I had to get this is my laptop I'm using now instead of my regular computer. So about half an hour before the call began, I've got like my Wi-Fi, and then I've got the landline, like the plug-in from the wall, and the wall socket system just stopped working, and so I was sitting around half an hour before the call, like trying to figure out what it was?
Oh, that's so tough. Well, I think it went fine. I mean, I don't know if the others who are on the call want to give any feedback, but from my perspective, it just felt like it was relatively natural. You cut out, and so I just answered the question that I thought you were asking, and we tried to just not make it obvious.
Nice. Yes, I think the timing was fortunate. So you guys took over the reins, and that was great. So. No, you did well, and you guys are, you both are quite different.
I don't get to talk to people from that. Seriously,
really?
Ross, are you still on the line? Because there wouldn't. No, I don't think so. There aren't Trump fans in Australia. They're just not a thing. So really? Having someone do it, I was like, sorry, okay, this is just not a point of view I have heard. So I was having fun.
Oh, okay, yes, it's quite common as I think we talked about before. It's quite common in Taiwan.
Interesting for me to have that. So thank you. He's very articulate in explaining why he believes what he believes, and I was trying to be, do the same from my perspective. So it was fun.
You did that very well. Yeah, no, that's what makes a great discussion. You both had very interesting points to make, but you were both very diplomatic and had some commonalities as well. So I think it was really good. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Thank you for organising it. Nice thing to do.
Yeah, I didn't realise he was going to leave so quickly. I sort of was told that the idea was that you guys
that we'd have a chat. Look, it's getting pretty late on a Friday night. I mean, I'm cool with that. Oh, hello, family.
It's my family. Yeah.
Hello.
My mum's on the phone. We're trying to get to my sister's wedding in
well, I'll let you go. This has been a lovely evening, and thank you. I don't know everyone who's been on the line, but thank you, everybody. It was a really good discussion.
No,
okay. Bye.
Thank you.